Well then, we are continuing in our series of Women of the Bible. You'll remember it's a series that we are going through from the beginning of September, following the report that came out from the Baptist Union earlier in the year, the Project Violet report. And I thought that it would be good for us to hear some of the characters and the voices of women in the scriptures. So we've heard of Lady Wisdom, we've thought of Eve, we've thought of Sarah, we've thought of Ruth and Naomi, we've thought of Esther, and who else have we thought about? Martha and Mary. And we're here today thinking about an unnamed woman from the scriptures who had been suffering greatly from a flow of blood for 12 years, the story tells us. She is a woman whose life has been blighted by this chronic condition that she suffers from, and for which she has seemingly tried all sorts of avenues to find recovery and healing, all to no avail. So what can we today, sitting some 2,000 odd years down the line, learn from this woman's story for our own relationship and journey of faith with Jesus? Well, if you have your Bibles with you, it might be helpful to have it open. At the passage today, you should find a Bible somewhere on the pew. It's on page 1496 again, if that's helpful for you. And we're going to go through this morning this story as it unfolds from chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel. So the story begins, a large crowd followed and pressed around him, the him there being Jesus. And we are perhaps wondering, where has he been? What has he been up to that has caused such a commotion? And if you turn back a page or so, you will see that Jesus had crossed over the Sea of Galilee to the eastern shore. He calmed a furious storm on the way and arrived at the Gerasenes area. He healed a man with a legion of demons, and then crossed the lake back again and had been met by a religious leader, a synagogue leader by the name of Jairus, whose daughter was dying. Jairus pleads with Jesus to go with him and to heal her. And Jesus is on his way when this encounter with the woman in our story occurs. And although, as I said earlier, she is an unnamed woman, we can deduce a number of things from her, which the story tells her. When we read in verses 25 and 26, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. This woman, as we've said, has this chronic bleeding disorder of some kind, which she has suffered from for such a length of time. Try to imagine yourself 12 years ago. Where were you? What were you doing? More importantly, what was your health like 12 years ago? 12 years is a very long time, isn't it? Try and imagine that you have been sick for all of that time, chronically sick. Imagine what it would have done to your life, your social life, your working life, your family life. Every aspect of your life is affected by this illness. That's where this woman's life is. And apart from the debilitating physical condition that she suffers from, there are the restrictions that are placed on her because of the Levitical law. So she couldn't touch anyone without making them unclean. And she herself remained unclean for the duration of her discharge, the Levitical law tells us. 12 years of illness and sickness. And so she was ceremonially unclean for all of that time, which meant that she was not allowed to go into the temple to worship. She was not allowed to bring her tithe and her offering to the altar. She was not allowed to go and be involved in any of the religious structures and practices that made up her existence, her life, and which was so important to the people of faith. In other words, she was cut off from all avenues of social and religious interaction. It would have been an endlessly miserable life. And then the story tells us that she has suffered a great deal in her pursuit of healing from this condition. So much so that she had visited numerous doctors whose treatments had caused her even greater distress. One commentator speaks of 11 so-called cures for such a condition, including tonics, astringents, and superstitions, like carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen rag in summer and a cotton rag in winter, or carrying a barley corn, which had been found in the dung of a white she-ass. While all of these cures, what all of these cures meant, that she had spent all of her resources, all of the money and possessions that she had to try and find relief from this illness, meaning that now she was poor. She was destitute. And added to all of that, none of these cures had worked. She had become poor without any relief. She was beyond all human help and was in desperate need. Sometimes life can present us, can't it, with seemingly impossible situations to deal with. And we can try and find all humanly possible solutions to problems, sometimes without little or any success. Perhaps you've also had times in your life like that, when you've been at your wit's end, not knowing what to do next or where to turn. Well, the turning point in this story comes in verses 27 and 28, when we read, "When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Jesus' reputation as a healer was already gaining a following, as we've already seen and heard in the story. And news about the healing of the man with the legion of demons most likely would have been circulating within the crowd's discussions about, have you heard this? Do you know what happened? That testimony, by the way, was coming straight from the man's lips himself. As we read at the end of that story, where the man had begged to go with Jesus, but Jesus had told him to go back to his home and be with his people, telling them all what the Lord had done for him. And he did just that. And all who heard it were amazed at that testimony. We might speculate that this unnamed woman herself could have been one of those that heard about this man's testimony, about this man's healing. She definitely heard about Jesus, because verse 27 tells us that. And she sees in him her only way of relief, her only way of rescue and healing. But unlike that earlier story of the man with the legion of demons, she wants her story to be secret. She wants her healing to be secret. So she comes up behind Jesus, saying to herself, if only I can touch his garments, all will be well. Now you might sit there and think to yourself, I wonder why she wanted it to go unnoticed. Why did she want it secret? Why didn't she want anybody else to know? And if you think about it, living under that strict Levitical law and those strict stipulations, knowing that her condition brought all of those restrictions, I think she's afraid to make herself known for what might happen to her if she's found out. Remember, the crowds are pressing in on Jesus. The crowds would have also been pressing in on her. And if they found out that she was present, that could have threatened her very existence because of what her condition meant for all of the other people, as stated in the law. One source likens this woman's condition to that of a leper. And we know how lepers were treated in biblical times, don't we? Shunned, carted off into little enclaves of their own, not allowed to be around anybody else. Perhaps she's also afraid to ask Jesus for help outright, for fear of rejection, for fear of being told no, he cannot or will not heal her. He is a rabbi, after all. In her eyes, she has this chronic disease that is making her unceremonially unclean. Again, because of the limits of the Jewish law placed on her and anyone who had contact with her, she would have been afraid to come to him openly. And on another level, this woman has been suffering for so long that she's very likely ashamed of her condition. She doesn't want all the world and everyone to know that she is there. Maybe she's been on the receiving end of unkind comments because of it, and nasty actions because of it, all towards her. All of these things, I think, go to make up what is vital in this woman's mind and thinking, that if Jesus is her only answer to her suffering, then all of this must be done in secret, without any fanfare. Verse 29 tells us, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Try and imagine that sensation for yourself. That realization, the emotions that you might have felt, joy, elation, relief, realizing that this terrible and life-debilitating journey that you have been on for 12 long years has come to an end. Perhaps we can't begin to put into words what this woman experienced in that moment. All that we can say is that it was transformational in her life, and that she would have seen a new life ahead of her. For this woman, there is only one thing left to do, to disappear into the crowd once again and move on with her life, seeking to rebuild all that had been broken, all that had been crushed because of this illness, taking in a new future. And perhaps that would have been a good place to end this story, wouldn't it? Because after all, that is what encounters with Jesus bring, the opportunity of new life and a new beginning. But there's a twist in this woman's story, in this tale, as we read in verse 30. Once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" It's a ludicrous thing to say, isn't it? If you think about it logically, the story has told us that the crowd following Jesus pressed in around him. In other words, there were people everywhere. The Greek word there used for pressing in on all, pressing in, is pressing in on all sides. It's like when you have two things and you push them together. That's what was going on here. And so there would have been lots of people around Jesus, touching him. What happened is that just as the woman experienced the healing in her body, so too Jesus perceived that power had gone out from him in that moment. What are we to make of that? Well, it reveals to us that Jesus heals someone without being asked to. And in that sense, this healing story is unusual in the scriptures. Most of the times, the appeal for healing is for someone from themselves or from a third party to come and heal them. Next, it shows us Jesus healing someone without him knowing about it until afterwards. And again, that's unusual in the regular accounts of healings in the gospel stories. And then also, although Jesus knows afterwards that something has happened, he doesn't know who it has benefited. That's why he asks the question, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples, of course, are confused and somewhat bewildered by Jesus' question, as we read in verse 31. They say, "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" They're perhaps saying what you or I might have said to Jesus, that everyone is touching you, and we're all getting touched in this crowd because we're all pressing up against one another. It's a little bit like asking in a rugby scrum, isn't it? "Who touched me?" Or in the Christmas and January sales and the scrum there, "Who touched me?" It doesn't make sense. But Jesus persists in finding an answer, and the woman's anonymity is over, as we read on in verses 32 and 33. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Why might she be afraid? Perhaps because she's recognized the enormity of what has happened to her, and her concern is that Jesus might be angry with her and reverse the healing that she has just received. I'll admit that sounds somewhat drastic, but remember this woman's state of mind because of the chronic years of sickness and illness that she has suffered from. It would have been very easy to think such things. For her, any glimmer of relief she is going to cling to for dear life, for she is in desperate need. For Jesus, though, and the gospel stories, the healing miracles are there as signs. Signs to point to the one who brings healing and restoration. And in that sense, the healing cannot remain secret, because it has to be revealed how it has come about, and because it is by God's glory and God's grace that it has occurred. Jesus also commends the woman for her faith. As we read in the next verse, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." He assures her that her healing is hers to keep, and he sends her on her way with peace and freedom. The peace there is the peace of mind and a sense of health and welfare in an individual. And the freedom is the sound and pure restoration of the body that has been so severely afflicted. A new lease of life has come, wholesome and healthy. So what can we learn from this woman's story, this remarkable encounter? Most of the commentators speak of this woman's faith, this unnamed woman had. She had the incredible faith to believe that even by touching the garment of Jesus, that she would be healed. Think about that for a moment. That was her faith. If only I can touch his cloak, I will be healed. It's an astounding thought, which becomes an amazing reality in this story. She recognized in Jesus the power to bring healing, restoration, and wholeness to life. And that is what we can take away from this woman's story for ourselves. That still today, Jesus brings healing. He brings restoration. He brings wholeness for all who will trust and believe in him. And that is the message of the good news that is ours to have and that we are called upon to share with others through our own stories of the way in which Jesus has worked in our lives. As we close, listen to the conclusion from the book, one that I've been using over this series, Out of the Shadows, Preaching the Women of the Bible, asking the question, what is the story of this woman? It says this: because of her illness, she had been rejected and marginalized by her community and her faith, exploited financially, traumatized physically, left in isolation and poverty. Somehow, she has the determination to find a way to Jesus. Through the crowd, Jesus listens to her and reinstates her to full personhood. He gave her a family, restores her to community, and makes her whole. The good news for her is about restoration and redemption. The remarkable thing about this woman's story is that, be it ever so fleeting in the Gospels, and it's also recorded in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, she is another example of someone whose life is touched by Jesus and whose life is transformed. And Jesus continues to touch lives today and transform them. Young lives and old lives, female lives and male lives, your life and my life, bringing to us more and more what it means to be saved and restored and made whole in our relationship with God. God who is our Creator and Lord. And so for this story, this woman's story, we can give thanks to God for it. Another example for us to ponder and think over, to help us to grow deeper in the knowledge and truth of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ today. Amen.